the night Cecilia Marsh walked into the Black Meridian. For the first time, she told herself it was just a job. She'd repeated that to herself 4 times on the subway ride over, twice in the elevator, and once more in front of the mirrored doors of the 42nd floor before they slid open and swallowed her whole. The Black Meridian wasn't a restaurant in any sense the word usually implied. It didn't have a sign outside. It didn't take reservations through any app you could download. It existed in the way certain things in this city existed, by permission, by fear, and by the quiet understanding that some doors only opened for people who already knew what was behind them. Cecilia knew because she'd been hired to balance its books. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and built in a way that her mother had always called substantial, and her college roommate had called gorgeously intimidating, and every boyfriend she'd ever had called a lot to handle, usually right before they stopped calling altogether. She had dark eyes that catalogued everything in a room before she'd consciously decided to look, and a mind that ran numerical patterns the way other people ran idle conversation, constantly, quietly, without effort. She was also, at this precise moment, carrying a leather portfolio against her chest like a shield, and pretending she wasn't aware that every pair of eyes in the room had tracked her the moment she stepped off the elevator. The Black Meridian's main floor was all dark wood and low amber light, the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they were either confessing something or about to. Round tables spread across a floor of black marble. Men in suits that cost more than her monthly rent sat in clusters, speaking in voices too low to carry. 2 bartenders moved behind a bar that ran the full length of the west wall without speaking to each other, which told her they'd been working together long enough that they didn't need to. She counted 6 exits, 3 security cameras visible. 2 more she estimated were hidden. Old habit, occupational necessity. A man in a charcoal jacket materialized at her elbow. He hadn't walked over. He had simply appeared, the way people in places like this tended to. "Mrs. Marsh." "Not a question." "That's me," she said. "Mr. Cavendish will see you at 9. You're early." He said it the way someone might point out a weather anomaly. Interesting. Not inconvenient. Simply a fact. "I like to get a feel for a space before I work in it," she said, which was true. And also the less embarrassing version of I was too anxious to sit on the subway for another 20 minutes. The man in charcoal. She would later learn his name was Preston, that he had worked for Cavendish for 11 years, and that he was the single most efficient human being she had ever encountered. Nodded once and gestured toward a table near the bar. "You can wait here. Can I bring you something?" "Water would be fine." He disappeared. She sat. She opened her portfolio, uncapped her pen, and pretended to review the intake documents she'd already memorized, because looking busy was armor and she had learned to wear it well. She was 3 pages in when she felt it. Not heard, felt. The room changed. It was the only way she could describe it later. Not that something happened, but that the atmosphere shifted, the way a barometric pressure drop announces a storm hours before the first cloud appears. The low murmur of conversation didn't stop, exactly, but it thinned. Men who had been leaning forward pulled back almost imperceptibly. The 2 bartenders both found something to do with their hands at the same moment. Cecilia looked up. He came through a door she hadn't clocked, a panel in the far wall, half hidden behind a bar shelf, and she immediately revised her count of exits upward. And he moved through the room the way water moves around stone. Not aggressively, not performing. He simply went where he intended to go, and the room rearranged itself to accommodate him. Damien Cavendish. She had researched him, of course. She always researched clients before intake meetings. She had found exactly what she'd expected to find, which was almost nothing useful. A name attached to a real estate holding company, a LLC registered in Delaware, 3 charitable foundations that existed in the technical sense without appearing to have ever held a fundraiser. The internet had 1 photograph, cropped badly, taken at some municipal gala 6 years ago. He'd been looking away from the camera. The man walking toward her now was not the kind of man photographs could contain, and she suspected he knew it. He was tall in a way that didn't call attention to itself. Dark hair, close cut, silvering at the temples. A suit that was neither flashy nor understated. It was simply correct, in the way a surgical instrument is correct, chosen for function so refined it had crossed over into its own aesthetic. He had the kind of face that would have been handsome at 20 and had become something more unsettling with age. Harder, more deliberate, the softness replaced by angles that suggested a long familiarity with difficult decisions. He was looking at her, not the way men sometimes looked at her, the quick assessment, the slight recalibration of expectation, the micro-expression she'd learned to read and brace for. He was looking at her the way she'd looked at the room when she walked in, like he was cataloguing, like he hadn't decided yet what she was. She didn't look away. She'd stopped doing that. He reached the table and didn't sit. "You're the accountant," he said. "I'm the forensic accountant," she said. "There's a distinction." Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement exactly, more like the quiet recognition of an unexpected variable. "Sit down, Mr. Cavendish," she said. "I have questions about your Q3 receivables." The room went very still. Later, Preston would tell her, in the flat, informational tone that was his only register, that in 11 years he had never once seen a person tell Damien Cavendish to sit down. Cavendish sat. He did it slowly, deliberately, like a man who had chosen to do something rather than being asked to. He settled into the chair, across from her, rested one forearm on the table, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, and had the distinct impression he'd cultivated specifically to be unreadable. "3 receivables," he said. "Your hospitality revenue is misclassified," she said, "consistently, across 18 months. Either your previous accountant didn't understand the difference between deferred revenue and accounts receivable, or someone instructed them not to." She paused. "I don't make assumptions about which. No, assumptions are expensive in my line of work." He was quiet for a moment. The low sound of the room had resumed around them cautiously, like wildlife returning after a predator moves through. "What do you charge?" he said. "More than you'll think is reasonable and less than I'm worth. We can negotiate after I finish the diagnostic audit." "You're confident," he said. It was not a compliment. It was not an insult. It was an observation, delivered with the same temperature as everything else he'd said. "I'm accurate," she said. "Confidence is a personality trait. Accuracy is a professional standard. I try not to confuse them." He looked at her for a long moment. Cecilia held her pen steady and did not shift in her seat. Even though something in his gaze had the quality of weight, the feeling of being assessed by something that didn't often encounter things it couldn't categorize. "You'll start Monday," he said. "I haven't agreed to the engagement yet," she said. "I have a few more questions." The corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. "Ask them," he said. She started Monday. The office they gave her was on the 39th floor, 3 levels below the main dining room, a room that was either a repurposed storage space or an executive suite that had fallen out of favor. She couldn't tell which. It had a window that looked out over the street below. A desk that was either an antique or an excellent reproduction, and a filing system that appeared to have been organized by someone with both exceptional attention to detail and a spectacular indifference to any conventional logic. She spent the first week just learning the architecture of it. Not the numbers, the structure behind the numbers, the logic of how things had been recorded and why. The places where the entries were slightly too clean, and the places where they were slightly too messy, both of which told her things. She didn't see Cavendish for 4 days. On the 5th day, she was in the small kitchen on 39, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its extremely slow work, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find him standing in the doorway, in a way that suggested he had been there for longer than she'd realized. "You're still here," he said. "It's 2 in the afternoon," she said. "I typically work until 7. Most people who've taken this engagement have left within the first week." "Why?" He studied her. "The work is complicated." "I like complicated work," she said. "It pays better." He was quiet. She turned back to the coffee machine, because she had learned, in the week she'd been here, that the silences in this building were not hostile. They were simply how Damien Cavendish processed things, and that waiting him out was more productive than filling the space. "How do you take it?" she asked. "A beat. Black," he said. She poured 2 cups and set his on the counter beside him without looking, because looking felt like it would make too much of something that was, operationally, just coffee. He picked it up. She went back to her desk. He didn't leave for 20 minutes. He stood in the doorway and read something on his phone, and didn't say anything else. And she worked, and didn't say anything else. And at some point she looked up and he was gone, and she had absolutely no useful framework for what had just happened. She added it to the mental file she was already keeping on Damien Cavendish and went back to his receivables. The problem with the receivables turned out to be more interesting than she'd expected, which was saying something, because she had expected it to be fairly interesting. There was a layer of legitimate misfiling, sloppy, probably innocent, probably attributable to whoever had done the books before her, and then underneath that, like a second skin, there was something else, not fraud exactly, or not only fraud. It was more like a parallel architecture, a shadow system that ran adjacent to the legitimate records, touching them at certain points, borrowing their credibility, and then diverting. She stared at it for 2 days before she understood what she was looking at. Then she went upstairs. Cavendish was at the bar on 42, talking to Preston in a low voice that stopped when she walked in. He looked at her once, registered something in her expression, and said something to Preston that made Preston immediately find somewhere else to be. She spread her printed sheets on the bar top because there was more surface area than her desk downstairs, and she needed to show him the full picture. "Someone has been siphoning from your operating accounts," she said without preamble, because this was not the kind of information that benefited from a warm-up, carefully, in amount small enough to clear automated flagging thresholds. Over approximately 31 months, she tapped a column of figures. "The total is $412,000. He looked at the sheets. She watched his face and learned nothing from it. "Do you know who?" he said. "I have a strong candidate," she said. "I want 48 more hours to confirm before I give you a name, because being wrong about this particular kind of accusation in this particular kind of organization seems like a significant health risk." Another of those silences. She had gotten better at reading them. This one was not displeasure. It was something closer to assessment. "Most people in your position would have come to me with a theory," he said. "Named a suspect. Moved on. Most people in my position would also have missed the second layer of entries on page 7, she said. "I'm not most people." He looked at her then. Not the cataloguing look from the first night. Not the assessing look from the kitchen. Something slightly different. Something that hadn't been there before. 48 hours, he said. She gathered her sheets. She was almost to the door when he said, behind her, very quietly, "Don't work past midnight." She stopped. "Excuse me, you've been here until 2 in the morning, 3 times this week." A pause. "It's unnecessary. The work is time-sensitive. The work will keep." Another pause. "You won't." She turned around. He was looking at his glass, not at her. "Mr. Cavendish," she said carefully, "is that concern?" "It's an operational preference," he said. "Key contractors are a liability when they're running on 4 hours of sleep." She looked at him for a moment longer than was probably advisable. "Good night," she said. She went home at 11. She was back at 7:15 the next morning. The name she gave him, 47 hours later, was his logistics manager, a man named Terence, who had been with the organization for 9 years and had apparently spent the last 31 months deciding that 9 years was enough of a head start to justify some quiet supplemental income. She laid out the documentation on the conference table. Not the bar this time. She'd been given access to the actual conference room, which she chose to interpret as professional promotion, and walked him through the evidence methodically, the way she'd been trained to walk juries through forensic accounting testimony. Cavendish listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of extraordinary. In her experience, men with his level of authority interrupted constantly, usually to demonstrate that they'd understood something before you'd finished explaining it. He let her finish. Then he looked at the documents for a moment in silence, and then he looked at her. "You're certain?" he said. "I'm accurate," she said, and watched the corner of his mouth move the way it had moved that first night. "What would you recommend?" She blinked. "I'm sorry. You found it. You understand the structure of it better than anyone else in this room." He leaned back slightly. "What would you recommend?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and recalibrated. "In a conventional corporate environment, I'd recommend immediate termination, civil suit for recovery, and a referral to federal authorities," she said. "I recognize those recommendations may require some adaptation to your specific operational context." Something that was almost for one brief second, a genuine smile moved across his face and disappeared before she could examine it. "Adapt them," he said. "Terminate immediately," she said. "Make the recovery private, and restructure your authorization protocols so no single person can touch accounts below the flagging threshold without a second sign-off." She paused. "I can design the new protocol, if you want it airtight, which, given your industry, I assume you do." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I want it airtight. Then I'll need access to the full account architecture," she said. "Not just the hospitality side." Another silence. Longer this time. She held it. "That's a significant level of trust," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for it because I need the access. I'm asking for it because you need the system, and I can't build you a system with gaps in it." She met his eyes. "You can vet me however you need to, run whatever background you haven't already run, which I assume is comprehensive given that I've been working here for 3 weeks. But the offer stands or it doesn't." He looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm the forensic accountant," she said. "There's a distinction." This time he didn't try to stop the expression on his face. The full access came through on a Friday. She found the authorization in her system when she arrived at 7:15, and she sat with her coffee for a moment before she opened it, the way she sometimes sat before opening a gift she'd been looking forward to and wanted to extend the anticipation of. Then she opened it and got to work. The architecture of the Black Meridian's finances was, in its own way, extraordinary. She had worked for corporations, for individuals of significant wealth, for non-profit whose books were a special kind of disaster. She had never seen anything quite like this. The way the legitimate structures had been built with genuine sophistication, layered on top of each other with the kind of long-term thinking that most financial architects didn't bring to their work. Someone had planned this meticulously, years ago, with the patience of a person who understood that good concealment was built slowly. She found herself genuinely admiring it. In the clinical way, she sometimes admired elegant solutions to complex problems. And then, she found herself thinking about the person who had designed it, and who that person had been to Cavendish. Because this kind of structure implied trust, the deep embedded kind, and that made her curious in ways she'd told herself to keep out of this engagement. She had gotten very good at telling herself things. She had gotten slightly less good over the last 3 weeks at actually doing them. The incident with the other contractor happened on a Tuesday, which felt like a uniquely Tuesday kind of thing to happen. She was crossing the main floor on 42. She had a standing morning check-in with Preston at 11, and she was 3 minutes early, which she considered being on time, when a man she hadn't met before stepped into her path. Not accidentally. The placement was deliberate. The way a car door opened into a cyclist's path is deliberate. He was broadly built, with the kind of confidence that came from size and the frequent experience of size being sufficient. "You're the new numbers girl," he said. She had worked very hard, for most of her professional life, at not reacting to the particular category of dismissal embedded in that sentence. She had gotten quite good at it. "I'm the forensic accountant," she said. "Can I help you with something? Just wondering why Cavendish has a civilian running around with access to the whole house," he said. "Seems like a liability." "I agree," she said pleasantly, "which is exactly why he hired someone qualified to evaluate it." She smiled. "Excuse me." She moved to step around him. He moved to block her again. "I'm not finished," he said. "I am," she said. She heard Cavendish's voice before she saw him. She had never heard him raise it. She didn't need to now. Something in the temperature of it, the quality of the delivery, made everyone on the floor still in the way that a sudden drop below freezing makes the air suddenly different. Raise. The broadly built man turned. His posture changed with a speed that told her everything she needed to know about the organizational hierarchy. Cavendish was standing 12 feet away, and he was looking at the man. Reyes, the way she imagined a clean room looks at contamination. "She's leaving," Reyes said, with slightly less confidence than he'd had 30 seconds ago. "I just wanted to make sure you'd thought through." "I don't do things without thinking them through," Cavendish said, "and I don't have contractors questioned on my floor." He paused. "We'll talk about this in my office." It was not an invitation. Reyes left. He didn't look at her again. Cavendish did. For a moment, just one. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize with any of the ones she'd been filing. It was direct in a way that made her feel, very briefly and inconveniently, like the room was smaller than it had been. "Are you all right?" he said. "Completely," she said, which was accurate. "Preston is in his office." "I know. I was on my way." He nodded. She went. She did not look back. She thought about his voice for the rest of the afternoon, and reminded herself firmly that this was an engagement, that he was a client, that she was a professional, and that all of that was true and would continue to be true. It kept being true. It also kept being increasingly difficult. The night she found the discrepancy in the insurance filings, she was there past midnight. She hadn't meant to be. She'd told herself, and, implicitly, him, that she wouldn't be. And she'd believed herself at 8 o'clock, when she'd started on what she expected to be a 2-hour block. But the numbers had done what numbers sometimes did when you were deep in a complex system. They had opened up and shown her something she hadn't been looking for. Something that sat just outside the light she'd been shining and required a slightly different angle to see clearly. She was rereading the same column for the 4th time when she heard footsteps outside her office. She knew the sound of them by now. She'd learned the acoustics of this building, the way she'd learned the logic of its finances, without trying to, just by paying attention. The door was open. He appeared in it, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, which was a version of Damien Cavendish she hadn't encountered before, and which required, she found, a brief recalibration. "It's 1 in the morning," he said. "I know," she said. "You said you'd be gone by midnight." "I found something." He came into the office. He came around to her side of the desk, which he hadn't done before. Her space was her space, and he'd treated it as such, and stood beside her and looked at the screen. She was acutely aware of the proximity. She was also very good at not showing when she was acutely aware of things. So she pointed at the column and explained what she'd found. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both precise. She answered them. "This has been here for how long?" he said. "At least 6 years," she said. "Possibly longer. It predates the records I have access to." He was quiet. Standing this close, she couldn't help seeing, that there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, and it took her a moment to identify it, because she hadn't expected it. It was fatigue. Not physical, not sleep deprivation, the deeper kind. The kind that came from carrying something for a long time without being able to set it down. This was the foundation, she said carefully, because she understood now what she was looking at. Whoever built your financial structure, this is what they built it on. The rest of it grew from here. He was very still. I know who built it, he said. She didn't ask. It wasn't her question to ask. Can you document it? He said. All of it. Clean. Verifiable. That's what I've been doing, she said. That's what I'm always doing. He turned and looked at her. This close, she couldn't perform not looking, not without making it more obvious, so she looked back, and she didn't know what was in her own expression, and couldn't control for it the way she usually could. Why are you still here? He said, and she understood he didn't mean why are you working late? Because the work is interesting, she said, which was true. That's the only reason? She was quiet for a moment. Mr. Cavendish, she said, you run an organization where the wrong answer to that question could be professionally significant. I run an organization where I've given you access to everything, he said. That's also professionally significant. She looked at him. He looked at her. The building was entirely quiet around them at 1 a.m, and she was suddenly aware that she had been in this building for 6 weeks, and that she knew the architecture of his financial life better than most people knew, the architecture of their own, and that she had known from approximately the 3rd day. That something between them was different than a conventional client engagement, and that she had been doing a very competent job of not acting on that knowledge. She was, after all, excellent at her job. You should know, she said, measuring each word, that I don't make decisions based on incomplete information. Neither do I, he said. Then we should probably both acknowledge, she said, that we have fairly complete information at this point. Another silence, different from the others. Miss Marshku, he said, very quietly. Cecilia, she said. Cecilia. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. If you want to leave this engagement, I'll arrange a full payout and a reference you can use anywhere in the city, and I'll understand. She looked at him. And if I don't want to leave the engagement? He held her gaze for a moment that stretched thin and taut as wire, and then I'll need you to keep working, he said, because this organization can't function without what you're building. I can do that, she said. And outside of the organization, he said, I'd like to have dinner with you. When you're willing. No pressure applied. No expectation. She was quiet for a moment, which she recognized was the inverse of their usual dynamic, and which he was being gracious about. Thursday, she said. Not here. Somewhere without a camera in every corner. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't a smile. Quite, but it was the closest she'd seen yet to his face doing something fully voluntary. I know a place, he said. I assumed you would, she said. She went home at 1:45. She slept, for the first time in 6 weeks, without running numbers in her head. Thursday came, and she wore the green dress that her friend called the closing argument dress, because, her friend had said, it was the dress she wore when she already knew she was going to win, but wanted the other party to feel the loss fully. She hadn't told her friend who she was having dinner with. That was a conversation for later, when she had more information, because she did not form conclusions on incomplete data. She never had. The restaurant was in a building with no sign outside, which she found grimly appropriate, and they were seated before they arrived, which meant he had called ahead, which meant he had thought about this. She filed that. He was already there when she walked in, standing beside the table, not sitting. And he was looking at the door when she came through it in a way that suggested he'd been watching for her for longer than he'd admit. He didn't say anything about the dress. He didn't look at her the way men looked at her in green dresses. Usually, the quick recalculation, the subtle shift in posture. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the first night, like he was very interested in what she was going to do next. "You're exactly on time," he said. "I'm always exactly on time," she said. "It's one of my few vanities." He held her chair. She sat. Damien Cavendish sat across from her, and for the first time in 6 weeks he looked like a man who was somewhere he'd chosen to be, rather than somewhere he'd been required to be. And that single difference, that small voluntary thing, changed the geometry of his face in a way that made her chest do something she chose not to analyze too carefully yet. "Tell me something that's not in a financial record," he said. "You first," she said. He considered. The restaurant murmured around them. "I grew up in Pittsburgh," he said. "My father ran a hardware store. I balanced his books before I understood what I was doing." A pause. "I was 8. She stared at him. "8, she said. "He paid me in comic books," he said. "It wasn't ethical, but the margins were good." She laughed. A real one. Not the professional courtesy laugh, the actual one that came out of her before she had time to root it through anything. He looked at it like it was something he wanted to remember. "Your turn?" he said. She told him about her mother's kitchen table, about the tax returns she'd done for the neighbors at 14. Because she'd been bored, and her mother had described it to someone at church, and it had gotten away from her. About the scholarship applications she'd formatted like balance sheets, because she didn't know a better way to organize information. About the first job where she'd caught a 7-figure discrepancy in a fund that was supposed to be going to pediatric research, and what she'd done with that information, and the year of difficulty that had followed, and how she would make the same decision again, and probably would at some point. He listened to all of it. He asked questions. Good ones. Not the kind designed to redirect the conversation toward himself, but the kind that were interested in the next layer of what she'd said. She noted this. She noted most things about him, at this point, in the careful running log she'd been keeping since the first night, and the log was looking less like a professional risk assessment and more like something else. And she had decided, somewhere around the 1st in the morning tonight, to stop pretending otherwise. They ate. They talked. The restaurant cycled through its other guests, and they stayed. At some point, he said, "You could have left after the first audit. You'd found enough to satisfy the scope of engagement." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him across the table, in the low amber light that reminded her of the light on the 42nd floor the night she'd first walked in, and she considered her answer with the care she always brought to situations where being accurate mattered more than being comfortable. "Because I could see that someone had built something very intelligent," she said, "and then lost track of it. And I wanted to understand how that happened and whether it could be repaired." She paused. "I've always been better at the complicated ones." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that all?" he said. She met his eyes. "No," she said. The candle between them burned down another half-inch in the silence that followed, which was not uncomfortable and not empty. It was the kind of silence that had been building for 6 weeks and had finally arrived at the place it had been heading all along. "The protocol system will be finished by end of month," she said eventually. "I know," he said. "After that, there's no structural reason for me to be in the building every day." "I'm aware," he said. "I'd like to continue the engagement," she said. "On new terms." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like that too," he said, and the simplicity of it. No performance, no strategy, just the plain statement of a thing, landed with a weight that all of his controlled, deliberate silences had never quite managed. Outside, the city ran its numbers, the traffic patterns, the late-night delivery routes, the financial systems cycling through overnight settlements in buildings, lit gold against the dark. She'd balanced books in most of those buildings. She knew the architecture of this city the way she knew most things. From the inside, from the foundation, from the logic hidden underneath the surface that told you, if you knew how to read it, exactly what something was actually worth. She looked at Damien Cavendish across the remains of their dinner in a restaurant with no sign outside, and she thought, I know what I'm looking at. She had known for weeks. She had just, finally, finished the audit.